My name is Camille Ray. I'm 39 years old. I used to be a lieutenant colonel in US cyber operations. For 16 years, I worked behind the scenes, protecting systems most people didn't even know existed. I wasn't flashy. I didn't care about titles. I just did my job. And I was loyal, fiercely loyal, especially to the wrong people. I used to think serving in the military would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. I was wrong. The real battle started when my own family dragged me into court and tried to strip away my name, my rights, and every piece of who I was. They didn't even look at me when I walked into the courtroom. Not Mom, not Lucas, not even Ava, the one who used to call me sister, like she meant it. They were all sitting together, heads down, flipping through papers, like this was some regular business meeting. I stood across from them behind my lawyer, feeling like a defendant at my own funeral. The judge called the session to order, and that's when Eva stood. Calm, polished, confident, like she'd been rehearsing this speech in front of a mirror for weeks. Your Honour, she began, we're here today out of concern. Camille has shown troubling signs of mental instability over the past year. We believe she's no longer capable of making safe decisions for herself or her estate. I blinked. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard. Then she pulled out a small leather-bound book and held it up. This is her personal journal, Eva continued. We found it in her home. The entries are concerning. In one, she writes, I forget entire days. I feel like I'm being watched. If I disappear, I hope no one finds me. My lawyer looked at me. I shook my head. I'd never seen that book in my life. I don't even keep journals. I don't write down feelings. I internalize them the way I was trained to. Do you recognize this Ms. Ray? The judge asked. No, ma'am, I said. And if I did, I certainly wouldn't leave it in a drawer I haven't opened since I moved in. Ava kept going. She handed over a stack of documents, psychiatric reports, prescriptions I'd never filled, appointments I'd never made. She even had audio files. This one, she said, is from a call Camille made on January 4th. She says, I've been hearing things again. It's getting worse. The courtroom filled with my voice, drained, exhausted. That wasn't just some random call. That was a private therapy session, a group support line for veterans. I'd been venting maybe for the first time in months. And now it was evidence. Where did you get that? I asked. It was in her sent email, Lucas chimed in, not even glancing at me. We were trying to help. Help. Right. By digging into my private files. By twisting my words. I looked around the room and saw Melissa, my childhood best friend, sitting behind Eva. Her eyes met mine for just a second before she looked away. She was here for them. A witness? Melissa, I said. Seriously, I'm sorry, Cam, she whispered. She said you needed help. That was the moment I felt something split inside me. Not anger, not yet. Just this quiet, cold realization. They weren't here to save me. They were here to replace me. Lucas wasn't just taking over my finances. Ava wasn't just worried. They had a plan, a legal strategy, and I wasn't part of it. The judge looked at me again. Do you have anything you'd like to say? Ms. Ray, I stood up, straightened my jacket. I served this country for 16 years. I protected systems most people don't even know exist. I've never harmed anyone, never broken the law, and I've never needed help from any of the people in this room. That journal is a lie. Those files are fake, and that audio was never meant for anyone outside of therapy. The judge nodded slowly. Given the seriousness of the materials presented, I'm placing a temporary hold on Ms. Ray's financial access until we complete an independent psychological evaluation. This is not a judgment, just a precaution. I sat back down. My hands didn't shake, my eyes didn't water. But inside, something went dark. They didn't just sue me, they erased me. I sat there motionless as the courtroom emptied out. My lawyer whispered something about regrouping, filing appeals, staying calm, but his voice felt a mile away. All I could hear was the echo of that sentence. This is not a judgment, just a precaution. No, it wasn't just a precaution. It was a calculated maneuver, and they knew exactly what they were doing. My family wasn't confused. They were coordinated. I drove home without turning on the radio. The silence helped. It always had. In the Air Force, I'd grown used to silence, not the absence of noise, but the presence of control, of discipline. My past wasn't filled with trophies or medals I like to show off. I wasn't that kind of soldier. I worked in cyber intelligence, a world where the most valuable moves were the ones no one noticed. I did my job, kept things stable, and when things went wrong, I made sure no one found out. That was the job. That was the sacrifice. I could have been promoted multiple times. My CO told me I had the clearest head in the room, the fastest hands on a system, the sharpest gut. But after the second major breach, when someone tried to pin a leak on a tech from my unit, I took the heat. I filed a falsified report that made it look like the breach was purely external. It wasn't. I knew it. My CO knew it. But the leak was from a young man with a baby on the way, and I'd been trained to protect the team, even if it meant stepping back. The recommendation for promotion was withdrawn, quietly. No ceremony, no reprimand, just a silent decline. I told myself it didn't matter. But now, sitting alone with a court order, questioning my sanity, I wasn't so sure. The world had a way of forgetting people who kept things together behind the scenes. And my family, they'd always thought I was distant, cold. Lucas used to joke about it whenever I came home on the rare holidays I actually made it. I remembered one dinner vividly. Thanksgiving, maybe 6 years ago. I flew in on a red-eye still smelling like recycled cabin air and walked into a house full of noise. Lucas raised his beer when he saw me. "Look who remembered we exist," he said. Everyone laughed. Except me. I stood there in uniform, still holding my bag. "Nice to see you too," I said. Mum came over and hugged me, but I could feel it. Even she didn't quite know what to say to me anymore. I wasn't married, no kids, no traditional career path they could understand, just classified assignments and base transfers. I ate in silence that night. When I left the next morning, no one asked when I'd be back. And I didn't offer. Over the years, I sent money when the roof leaked, when Lucas's daughter needed surgery, when Dad was out of work. I never asked for thanks. I didn't do it for that. I did it because that's what you do when you're family. You cover the gap. You make things work. You protect the system even if it doesn't protect you. But none of that mattered now. All the silent help, the quiet visits, the emotional restraint, it had turned into ammunition for them. Eva used it to paint me as detached. Lucas framed it as proof I had no connection to reality. And the rest of them, they just nodded along. The most dangerous part was I understood why it worked. Most people didn't know what to make of someone like me. A woman in uniform who didn't cry easily or talk about feelings or show up for baby showers. They filled in the blanks. And now the blanks were being filled in court documents. I sat on my couch looking around my apartment. Everything was in order, clean, minimal. My rifle medal was still on the shelf, half hidden behind a plant. My desktop monitors were off screens, black and still. I pulled up an old secure drive and clicked into archived service reports. I read through a few looking for something, anything that could remind me who I was outside of that courtroom. Then I opened a folder labelled Family. Just a few photos. Lucas at graduation, Eva at their wedding, Mom on her birthday. No captions, no notes. Just frozen moments I had clung to as proof that I belonged somewhere. But tonight, they felt like surveillance stills. Distant, cold, like they'd never wanted me in the picture to begin with. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Maybe they had always thought I was broken, and maybe I had believed it too until now. But I wasn't broken. I was trained. I was precise. And now I was awake. I started to remember all the times I'd been there for them without ever being seen. The money transfers I made quietly when Lucas's car broke down and he didn't want to ask Dad for help. The tuition I paid for my niece's summer program. Eva never even said thank you, but I saw the post on Facebook all smiles and we're so proud of our girl. Not once did they mention my name. It was like I was some ghost with a credit card. When Mum called me 2 years ago, it wasn't to check on me. It was to talk about the will. It's not that I want to pressure you, she said, her voice syrupy over the phone, but it's hard for the family to justify including someone who isn't really here. You live so far, you never bring anyone home. It looks strange. I was halfway through a deployment in Germany when she said that. I had 6 monitors blinking in front of me, a headset half on, and I was watching encrypted data streams roll across the screen while my mother lectured me about appearances. You mean because I don't have a husband and 3 kids? I asked. You know what I mean, she replied. It's time to settle down. Make roots. Otherwise you're just passing through. I wanted to say I built roots on 6 bases. I made homes in concrete barracks and blackout rooms and places no one visits on purpose. But I didn't say any of that. I just said I understand. Because I did. I understood what she wanted me to be. I just wasn't it. And I was tired of trying. I didn't argue, I didn't push, I just accepted my place. That was how I operated. Quiet, controlled, predictable. After my ACL surgery the year before, I had no one to list as an emergency contact. I'd been reassigned stateside after a knee injury during a security lockdown. It was minor, but protocol said I had to recover under civilian care. Eva drove me home from the hospital. She brought soup. She tucked a blanket around my shoulders like she cared. I remember thinking, maybe she sees me. Maybe this is a turning point. So, when the hospital handed me a stack of paperwork and asked if I had someone I trusted to make medical decisions in case of emergency, I put Eva's name down, without hesitation. That's the part that hurts most now. Not the betrayal, not even the lie in court, but that at one point, I believed she had my back. I gave her legal power of attorney over my medical decisions, never imagining she'd use that signature as a way in. That she'd keep the document, that she'd copy it, that it would be the first crack in the wall she and Lucas built against me. I lived a life built on silence, on not drawing attention, on keeping things smooth and manageable for everyone else. I didn't post on social media. I didn't fly in for every wedding or birthday. I sent gifts, paid bills, never asked to be repaid or even acknowledged. But in their eyes, silence meant absence. Absence became neglect. And neglect over time turned into something they could weaponize. She's not stable. She doesn't keep in touch. We don't know what she's doing. That's what Melissa said on the stand. My oldest friend. She used to be warm. Then, one day, it was like a switch flipped. She stopped coming around. She stopped trusting people. The truth was, I hadn't changed. I just stopped pretending I fit into a world that never made space for someone like me. I was a good soldier, a good operator, a decent daughter, even if they never saw it. But I wasn't the kind of woman my family could explain at dinner parties. And instead of learning how to love me anyway, they quietly erased me one misunderstanding at a time. That night, I sat on the floor of my living room next to a box I'd been meaning to unpack for years. Inside were photos, old letters, notes from commanders, training commendations. At the very bottom was the discharge form I'd signed when I left active duty. Honourable service, 15 years, 7 months. I folded it in half and slipped it into my bag. I didn't know what I was preparing for yet, but I knew it was coming. It didn't take long. Within days, I was served papers wrapped in a sterile manila envelope delivered to my door like a package I never ordered. The lawsuit was real, heavy, intentional. The cover letter alone made my stomach turn. Petition for permanent conservatorship. It was signed by Eva, not Lucas, not even a shared submission. Just Ava with her clean, confident signature at the bottom, like this was a PTA memo, not a declaration of war. I flipped through the attached documents. Pages and pages of so-called evidence. Psychiatric assessments I'd never sat for. Signed by a name I didn't recognise. Diagnoses I'd never been given: dissociative episodes, paranoid delusions, major depressive disorder. They had created an entire medical profile for me out of thin air. Not just notes, entire case histories, medication lists, even fake appointment summaries, all tied to my name. Tucked between the medical reports were printed emails. Some of them real, some twisted, stripped of context, reworded, or cut at just the right sentence to sound unhinged. One was from a month ago. I had written to an old friend from service. I'd said something like, "I'm trying to stay off the grid until I know who's been accessing my files." It was a joke, a dry comment about spam emails and login alerts I couldn't trace. They turned it into Exhibit C. Subject believes she's being followed. Paranoid behaviour consistent with prior claims. My words used to build a narrative I didn't even recognise. A story I wasn't writing. And then near the bottom of the packet, there it was. A copy of the medical power of attorney I'd signed after surgery. The signature circled in red. The date highlighted. And under it, Ava's name marked as designated guardian in event of incapacity. That was the moment my stomach dropped. I had given them the key. I handed it over willingly without a second thought, because I believed in family. Because Ava brought soup. Because she tucked in a blanket and smiled like she cared. Now that one signature had unlocked a legal pathway for them to come after everything, my accounts, my name, my rights. The lawsuit didn't just ask to manage my finances. It proposed the removal of my authority as a legal adult, my voting rights, my decision-making power. It requested control over my medical decisions, access to my bank records, and the ability to act in my name for matters of familial interest. They were trying to disappear me without ever touching me. And the most disturbing part, they were doing it legally. I looked over the names on the documents again. The doctors listed in the reports weren't from any VA facility I'd ever visited. One clinic didn't even exist anymore, I checked. It had closed 2 years prior. But that didn't stop them from attaching a recent assessment dated just 3 months ago. They even included a recommendation for protective institutionalization if symptoms persist. Protective. Like I was a threat to myself. Like I was some unstable burden that needed to be locked away. I'd read case studies in military briefings about psychological warfare, how certain regimes manipulated paperwork to erase people without ever laying a hand on them. I never imagined I'd be the subject of something that looked so similar, and it came from my own family. I called the number listed on one of the reports just to be sure. A woman answered. "This is Northdale Mental Health. I asked if Dr. William J. Reed still practiced there. He hasn't worked here since 2020, she said. I thanked her, hung up, and took a screenshot of the call. I began saving everything. Dates, documents. I bought an external hard drive and made 3 backups. One for me, one for my lawyer, one that no one would find. I wasn't going to walk into court again without ammunition, and I sure as hell wasn't going to be blindsided twice. The betrayal had been calculated. It wasn't emotional, it was procedural. This wasn't a family falling apart. It was a hostile takeover disguised in legal paperwork and pastel-coloured concern. Even the tone of the lawsuit was manipulative. Words like unfortunate, tragic, and heartbreaking peppered throughout. Phrases designed to soften the blow while gutting me entirely. They spoke like I was already gone, like I wasn't in the room, like my absence had already been written into the script. But I wasn't gone. I was right here, watching, listening, calculating. They thought I would fold, maybe even disappear out of shame or confusion, but I'd spent too many years operating in the shadows to be taken down by a stack of forged documents and a few doctored emails. I knew how they moved now. I knew what they wanted, and more importantly, I knew how to prove they were lying. They weren't after my mind. They wanted my name, my accounts, my silence. So when the court date came, I didn't flinch. I walked into that hearing like I used to walk into mission briefings, shoulders squared, jaw set, every emotion filed into a locked drawer in the back of my mind. The courtroom was colder this time, maybe because I knew what was coming. The judge sat higher than before, or maybe I just felt smaller, now that my legal identity was under attack. Lucas sat to my right, Eva beside him, their lawyer flipping through notes with the confidence of someone who thinks the story's already been written. "We're not here to shame Ms. Ray," their lawyer began. "We're here to protect her. And if necessary, protect others." He used that voice, the kind that sounds like it's dripping with care, but hides a knife underneath. Ms. Ray has a long history of service. We honour that, but recent behaviours and concerning communications suggest a rapid decline in her mental stability. He handed over a flash drive. "We'd like to enter this audio into the record." The judge nodded. A bailiff brought a small speaker forward. The room filled with my voice, flat, low, raw. "Sometimes I can't tell what's real anymore," the recording said. "It's like I'm outside myself, watching, waiting for something I can't name." That was me. That was my voice. But not the whole story. It had been a closed therapy session, a private group for veterans coping with PTSD. That line was from a longer conversation about trauma triggers, but they didn't include the context. They cut the start, trimmed the end, and left the most vulnerable sentence standing on its own like a weapon. "Camille," the judge said, "would you like to respond?" I stood up slowly. No trembling, no drama, just control. "Yes, Your Honour. That recording was taken from a confidential support session. It was not a diagnosis. It was a group discussion between veterans. I was describing what it feels like when I get overwhelmed, not declaring myself delusional." I turned slightly toward the gallery, made sure Ava could see my eyes. "I've never hurt myself. I've never hurt anyone. I've never been arrested or hospitalized for psychiatric reasons. I see a therapist. Yes, that doesn't make me incompetent. It makes me responsible." There was a pause. The judge scribbled something down. I continued. "The report submitted by the plaintiffs includes references to evaluations that never happened, appointments I never made, and even doctors who no longer practice. I've brought evidence to counter each claim." I handed a folder to my attorney, who delivered it to the bench. "Call logs, emails, notarized statements," I added, including one from the clinic that confirms Dr. William J. Reed hasn't worked there since 2020. Ava looked down. Lucas stared straight ahead. They didn't expect me to fight this hard, to be this prepared, but none of that changed what came next. The judge cleared her throat. "While the authenticity of Ms. Ray's defense materials will be reviewed, the court must prioritize immediate safety. Given the evidence submitted, and until an independent psychological evaluation can be conducted, I am granting temporary financial conservatorship to Mr. Lucas Ray." She looked at me directly. "This is not a statement on your character or your past. It is simply a temporary measure." I nodded once. Not because I agreed, but because I knew arguing wouldn't help me now. My path wasn't through emotion. It was through precision, through truth, through the system they tried to weaponize. As we left the courtroom, Lucas tried to offer a glance, maybe even a look of guilt. But I walked right past him. Past Eva. Past the fake concern, the lies dressed in legal language, the pity that tasted like poison. Because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't broken. I wasn't losing. I was learning, and I wasn't done. They didn't need me to go mad. They just needed the world to think I already had. But what they didn't count on, what they never understood, was that once I start tracking a pattern, I don't stop. That's the one thing they should have remembered from my military record. I'm not the loudest. I'm not the angriest. I'm just the one who keeps digging. 3 days after the hearing, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was thin, cream-coloured, and looked harmless. I almost tossed it with the rest of the junk mail. But then I saw the seal, Department of Veterans Affairs. The return address was from a benefit processing centre I'd never had contact with. I opened it. Inside was a simple thank you note. Dear Ms. Camille Ray, we've processed your disability adjustment claim and updated your benefits accordingly. We appreciate your continued communication and have finalised your direct deposit changes as requested. Sincerely, Office of Veteran Services. I hadn't filed a claim. Not recently. Not in the last year. I hadn't updated anything. My benefits were minimal. I'd never pursued full disability status. I didn't need to. But someone clearly thought I did, and someone had changed the deposit information. I pulled up my VA account online, logged in through the encrypted browser I always used. The dashboard was clean, but the recent activity told another story. There were logins from an IP I didn't recognise, 3 in fact, all from the same city Eva lived in, all on weekends, all between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. The last one was 10 days ago. I clicked into the benefits section. Someone had accessed the disability form, opened it, submitted it, then downloaded a confirmation PDF. I hadn't received any of those emails. Whoever filed the claim had rerouted my contact info. They changed the email on file, the phone number, even the emergency contact, replacing it with Ava's name. And then I saw the real kicker. Under the signature field on the digital form, where they had to upload a signed document, there was a scanned image of my name. Sloppy, pixelated, just a little off. My signature, but not mine. I had a habit of signing with a slight right slant. This one curved left just enough to notice if you looked closely. It was subtle, barely enough to catch with the naked eye. But I remembered exactly where I'd seen that crooked slant before. Eva's Christmas cards. She always signed them for both her and Lucas. With love, Ava and Lucas. Her L curved left, her C curved left, and her version of my name also curved left. I pulled one of the cards out of the kitchen drawer, compared it. It matched. She'd practiced. Or copied. Maybe both. My jaw clenched, but I didn't panic. I took screenshots of every page, every timestamp. I downloaded logs, compiled IP addresses, printed records. This wasn't just a lie, it was a federal offence. Fraudulent claims submitted under my name, misuse of government resources, identity theft. It wasn't just about family now. This was a crime. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I knew how the system worked. If I went in guns blazing, they'd paint me as paranoid again. Another episode, another sign I was not well. So I documented. I cross-checked. I sent encrypted messages to 2 people I trusted from my unit, former cybersecurity experts, who now worked in civilian forensics. I didn't explain much, just asked them to trace the digital trail from their end. Confirm the IPs. Quietly. While I waited for a response, I filed a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, to get my full benefit history from the VA. If they'd filed under my name, they'd left footprints, and I knew exactly how to find them. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I'd crumble. But I saw the pattern forming now. It was never about proving I was unwell. It was about creating enough noise around my name that I couldn't fight back. If they could make the system question me, they wouldn't have to silence me. The system would do it for them. But they underestimated the one part of me they never understood. I know how systems work. I know how to break them. And more importantly, I know how to protect myself from the inside out. So I stopped playing defense. If they wanted to make this a war of paperwork and digital ghosts, I was ready. The first thing I did was send an encrypted drive to Nolan, my old signals analyst. He owed me a favour. 2 days later, I had the full geolocation trail from the suspicious IPs. All 3 pointed back to a single street Eva and Lucas's neighbourhood. One was registered to a private home. Another was from a co-working space downtown. The third pinged from a university where Eva occasionally lectured. That confirmed it. The logins into my VA account weren't just from the same city. They were from devices connected to them directly. But that was only the beginning. I started cross-referencing every login timestamp with my own travel history. I'd kept all my deployment orders, even the unclassified ones. From the timestamps on 2 of the fraudulent actions, I was physically stationed in Eastern Europe, clear across the ocean. Not only was I out of the country, I was on a base with biometric check-ins. I had logged security access at the exact same hour those VA forms were submitted from a city in the US. I wasn't just proving fraud, I was proving alibi. I compiled flight records, passport stamps, customs declarations. Not because I needed them legally yet, but because I knew this had to be airtight. Then came Lucas. On the surface, he was clean basic 9-to-5 accounting job, 2 cars, 1 mortgage. But his recent tax filings showed something odd: large deposits labelled as consulting reimbursements. No company name, no IRS 1099 forms. Just vague income that didn't match his known job. I followed the paper trail to a limited liability company based in Delaware. From there, it jumped offshore Barbados, then the Caymans. That's when I knew. They weren't just trying to control me. They were laundering something. My guess, they needed access to my name and status to push certain assets into cleaner accounts. Veteran status, government pension eligibility, possibly even healthcare benefits my name carried access. And someone, likely Lucas, was moving money behind that shield. I traced one entity listed on a registration doc back to a firm that had once used my social security number to verify a partner identity. A shell company. Entirely made up. My signature forged. My details stolen. But they forgot something in the details. They forgot who I am. I pulled out old FOIA request logs, scoured metadata from notarized claims they'd submitted. One document submitted to the court included a signed declaration saying I had attended a psychiatric consultation on June 14th. But that same day, I was signing documents at the US Embassy in Warsaw. I had the time-stamped badge record the embassy log and the consular officer's email. That was the moment I smiled. They weren't sloppy, they were arrogant. They assumed no one checks. They assumed I was too far gone to care. To strengthen my case, I needed to understand not just what they were doing, but how long they had been planning it. So I went further back, into old emails, archived voicemails. Every odd interaction suddenly carried new weight. I remembered a family dinner 2 years ago. Lucas had asked offhand if I ever updated my retirement paperwork. I'd brushed it off, assuming it was just small talk. But now I realised he'd been fishing, testing how much I monitored my own systems. He probably thought I was too detached, too distracted to notice slow, quiet theft. That's what made me dangerous to them. I was present in ways they never expected. I remembered Eva once texting, "I can help you organise your paperwork if you're too busy." I'd said no, of course, but now it was clear that was her attempt to gain access, to normalise the idea that they were just helping. Even my military login credentials had been tested. There were failed attempts on my DoD-secured account from 2 flagged IPs also traced back to their area. They hadn't breached the system, but they tried. They were probing every entry point. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was an operation. I opened up my backup drives from 4 years ago. On a whim, I compared one notarized document, Lucas submitted with a home insurance form I'd scanned during my last stateside assignment. The signature block was identical, not just in name, but in spacing alignment and even the faint watermark of the scanner itself. He had reused my scan. He had saved it for years. I had to close my eyes for a moment, not from sadness, but from how meticulous they'd been, how calculated. This wasn't a rash decision. This was years in the making. And then came the final pattern that pulled it all together, a set of wire transfers in my name totaling over $82,000 funneled through an inactive business entity registered in my social number. The transfers were routed through an intermediary bank that specialized in digital asset compliance, a fancy way of saying they didn't ask too many questions. That account had been closed 6 months ago. I had never opened it, but the closure notice sent to Eva's mailing address. Now I had it, not just suspicion, not just theory, proof, undeniable. They weren't just trying to erase me from the family. They were using me to build something corrupt, and when I was no longer useful, they tried to erase the source of it all, me. But they forgot the one detail that mattered most. I remember everything. So I left my apartment before dawn and drove out to Greenwood National Cemetery. On the way, I passed mile markers. I couldn't read past, they blurred like memories I didn't want to face. I carried with me the same quiet strength I'd used in boardrooms and war rooms. That strength had a name, Jerome Hastings. We met in Kabul. He was a communications specialist, quiet, steady, dependable. But after his deployment, his identity fractured. Documents stopped matching. Money vanished. Global vet benefit accounts flagged as fraudulent. He spiraled. His family accused him. Get help, they said, even though he never had psychiatric records. By the time he had a day in court, the damage was irreparable. He didn't make it. He took his own life. There was no trial. No day to stand in uniform and say, I am not broken. He never got that chance. I walked through the rows of headstones until I found his. Sergeant Jerome T. Hastings read the inscription, August 1982, March 2024. The wind stirred autumn leaves over the grave. I didn't kneel. I just stood. Hey, Jerome, I whispered, my breath fogged in the chill. This is what they did to you. What I'm up against. They stole everything from you and your life. They twisted your identity until no one knew who you were. I won't let them take mine. I won't let them bury me the way they buried you. There was no answer, only the soft scrape of grass under my boots and the mournful creak of trees. I placed a single white carnation on his marker. Then I pulled out the small photo his mother had given me, a military portrait crisp and proud with cinnamon-coloured frame. I traced his face. I swear, Jerome, I'll carry this for both of us. That afternoon, I found his mother Marisol in a small community centre, a place veterans met for paperwork help and support. She was the same woman who'd pleaded with me during Jerome's darkest days. He needs paperwork help, she said then, mistakenly believing I could save him. I had failed her. I stared down at the floor. I couldn't meet her eyes at first. When I did, she looked older than her 35 years, grief-torn but fierce. Camille, she said quietly, you did what you had to do. There was no blame in her voice, just relief that he wasn't forgotten. He believed them. They convinced him he was unstable, took his benefits, took his pride. We begged, but no one listened. They told us, let him rest, like death was easier than injustice. I sat beside her at a chipped wooden table and pulled out my notes, the IP logs forged signatures, alibi documents. Marisol's eyes widened when she saw the lines tracing back to family. That's what happened to my son, she said, voice cracking. They used his issues to control him. His PTSD became proof he was unfit. But it was never about mental health. It was about erasing him. I thanked her. I told her I would make sure Jerome's story wasn't the end. It won't be, I said. I'll bring them to court, and I'll make sure the world sees what they did. Your son will have his day in court posthumously if I have to. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Then go win it, she whispered. Win it for him. Win it for all of us who are still standing. Inside, something settled. Not peace, but resolution. Jerome had given me something I never imagined I'd need a purpose beyond my own vindication. I stood ready to act. She gave me a small folder. Inside were copies of Jerome's bank statements, communication logs, personal emails, all the proof that should have been enough, but never was. I took them without asking. That night, I sat in my apartment, lit only by a desk lamp. I loaded Jerome's documents alongside my own. I encrypted everything, zipped it into multiple drives, masked the metadata, and emailed copies to a federal liaison. I knew someone who owed me a favour from a joint cyber task force. I wrote Jerome Hastings. Identity stolen, life stolen, evidence enclosed. I hit send. My pulse did a slow dance not of fear, but of determination. In the hours that followed, I rehearsed what I would say to judges, to reporters, to Congress if I had to. They stole his name. I won't let them take mine. I didn't practice for performance. I practiced for truth. It was after midnight when I realised I hadn't eaten. I stood and walked to the balcony. City lights dotted the horizon. I inhaled deeply. Jerome's words, well, not his, but mine to him echoed in my head. This was bigger than me now, bigger than any court. This was about protecting every soldier whose identity became a weapon against them. I tucked in my shirt, straightened my spine, and whispered into the night. It ends now. My phone buzzed. A message from Nolan Data shared. Federal liaison acknowledged. Their opening inquiry, I didn't smile. I closed my eyes. Not because I was relieved, but because I was ready. I haven't lost a soldier, not again. The next morning, I walked into the courtroom with the same steady calm I'd practiced in front of my apartment window. The fluorescent lights, the hush, the smell of polished wood, everything felt charged. I carried a single sealed file in my hand. Inside was everything hacked. IP logs, bank transfers, forged documents, Jerome's records paired with mine, all wrapped in airtight chronology and marked with digital timestamps. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Lucas and Eva sat across the aisle, each surrounded by their legal team. Ava's glossy smile was gone. She looked thin hands trembling as she twisted the edge of her courtroom pad. Lucas's jaw was rigid. Then there was the judge scanning documents at the bench, face unreadable. I placed the file on the table in front of him, my hand steady. Every eye in the room locked on me, expectant, curious. Your Honour, I said, voice measured. I submit this sealed file for the court's review. Inside are findings from forensic investigators who have traced fraudulent claims offshore funds and forged signatures directly to Ms. Eva Stanton and Mr. Lucas Davenport. I request that the court allow these documents to be opened under seal and reviewed by federal representatives before proceeding. Eva gasped, sharp enough to catch attention. Lucas's eyes darted, searching the judge like a soldier looking for retreat. The judge nodded slowly. File to be opened. Courtroom sealed until further notice. His voice was quiet, but firm. Proceed. The courtroom door shut. A silence fell so thick you could hear paper rustle. I watched as court officers stepped aside and two agents in suits entered from the hallway, one wearing an IRS lapel pin, the other FTC. Their presence levelled the room. This was bigger than a family feud now. I took a seat. My hands lay calmly in my lap. No need to speak. The evidence spoke louder. I saw Eva lean forward, whispering urgently to her lawyer. Lucas sat motionless, face ashen. Agents slid chairs beside me. Agent Miller IRS, one introduced. Agent Chen FTC. They flashed credentials at the judge. We verified the leads. We request authorization to begin on-site asset freeze orders. The judge paused, scanning them, then nodded. He turned to me. Ms. Harwood, are you requesting anything further? They'd changed my name in court filings. Camille Harwood. I let it stand. I inhaled. Your Honour, in light of this new evidence, I also request protective orders to safeguard veteran identities linked to the fraudulent claims. He scribbled a note. All motions granted. Agents, you may proceed. The agents rose, flashing nods at me. Then they approached Ava's table. Lucas rose, voice shaking. We object. This is... The agent cleared his throat. Sir, I recommend you remain seated. He turned to Eva. Ma'am, by order of the court, you are restrained from transferring or accessing any assets until inquiry concludes. Please remain until we escort you. Ava went white. She dropped her pad. Lucas sank back down, jaw slack. Lawyers scrambled. I looked away toward the back bench where Jerome's mother sat. She caught my eye and squeezed my hand, tears shining. I nodded, once reminding her we weren't done. The agents cuffed Eva and quickly guided her out. Lucas was next. He tried to stand, but a firm hand on his shoulder stopped him. His face collapsed. His lawyer protested, but the judge overrode proceed. Federal agents led Lucas past me. He paused for a split second, his gaze meeting mine, fear, disbelief, betrayal. Then he was gone. The courtroom exhaled. I lowered my head, fighting the rush of triumph tempered by grief. I'd struck, but not rejoiced. The judge looked to me. Ms. Harwood, your evidence initiated these actions. You may remain or step outside. I stood. I'll remain, Your Honour. I sat, heart-pounding but steady. The judge reviewed the remaining motions. Temporary conservatorship lifted immediately, harvesting orders for frozen assets, protective orders extended, and then adjourned the hearing until federal review concluded. Only then would we resume. Inside me, adrenaline roared. I sat still until the gavel hit twice, then packed my file and passed agents in the hallway. Agent Miller whispered. Good job, I nodded. What's next? He gave me a folder. Prepare for deposition. They want your full digital chain. I took it, spine straight. Outside, journalists clustered in the foyer, blinding lights, mics the chaos of headlines in progress. I walked past, voice low but clear, as I answered one question. Yes, the truth is what matters. I didn't stop. In the elevator, I exhaled for the first time. Gone wasn't happiness, it was release. I delivered the strike. Now I had to hold. They brought lawyers, I brought the truth. I stepped into my apartment and watched as my phone buzzed non-stop alerts from journalists, family lawyers, and veterans organisations. But I shut the door behind me and didn't pick it up. Instead, I booted up my laptop and reopened the folders Shadowline had prepared. Now we were entering a different battlefield. The first call came from Agent Miller. The Valen Group Shell Corporation is officially under federal investigation. We're onboarding veterans' rights advocates to handle outreach. The IRS freeze covers domestic and certain offshore accounts. I nodded as much to myself as to him. Good. What about the transactions over 300 veterans, roughly seven-figure sum, all traced back to Valen Group? We've got Bitcoin trails, escrow chains, falsified paperwork, the works. He paused. They used loopholes you helped design in that cybersecurity framework a few years ago. My chest tightened. Years ago, I'd authored a data-sharing protocol to help veterans file federal relief claims faster. It was secure, rigorous encryption layered, but Lucas had repurposed that system. He'd inserted redirect keys, hidden backdoor permissions. I'd signed off on the framework, not knowing it could be weaponized. I closed my eyes and pressed my temples. Betrayal never smarts less even when it's strategic. That infrastructure was never for laundering money, I said quietly. It was to help people. Exactly, Miller replied. They hijacked a tool built for trust, built by you for their fortune. I let that sit, then asked, what about power of attorney I'd given Eva as medical proxy broad legal authority? She'd used it to open shell identities. She and Lucas created 4 subsidiary names, Jasper Miller, Anna Price, Michael Dunn, and Rebecca Thomas, all used to launder funds and claim veteran benefits without oversight. Agent Chen's voice echoed, unfortunately, some names overlap with real veterans. That's where this gets complicated. I swallowed. So, they're siphoning money meant for real people, and our protective orders are already stopping further damage. Yes, said Miller. But there's more. Lucas used your name and authority post-surgery, well before you were incapacitated, to sign off on documents opening accounts. They're trying to argue you authorized it all. I clenched my jaw. They can't argue I authorized fraudulent shell accounts. We have my travel records IP logs showing I wasn't even in the country when the signatures were executed. I opened the folder and brought up the GeoPoint metadata, cross-checked with timestamps and notarized dates. It was airtight courts would eat this up. That's more than enough, Chen replied. But we need you in a federal deposition to map out every transaction thread. Understood, I said. Let's schedule it. I closed the laptop and sat back. The storm was just starting, but I felt a buried candle flare. To rebuild truth, I had to walk through the ashes. Later that morning, I met my team at a quiet rented workspace. Anna, Miles Cole. They hovered around a conference table hooked up to encrypted screens. They'd been working behind the scenes to trace the money and infrastructure. Miles started. Here are the offshore transfers. A transfer on April 3rd, 2024, $2.3 million went to Cayman account, QX131. That account is linked to Arvos International Node. He switched the screen. Look here, VP logs from your lightweight protocol show authentication passed, but IP shows Mid-Atlantic, not you. I recognized both the timestamp and the misinformation. I leaned forward. That's when I was in Australia on deployment leave, can't be me. Anna added. Exactly, but it's under your credentials. That's what they've done, used stolen tokens from your system to authorize fraud. The room went quiet. Cole spoke gently. We've got testimony from Jerome's mother. I spoke with her. She's ready to testify about how Jerome died penniless after his name was used. She's breaking down some of the shell names. I closed my eyes. The memory of Jerome washed over me. His grave had reminded me we weren't just fighting a family war anymore. This was a criminal network preying on the vulnerable. I tapped the table. Let's compile everything. Emails between Lucas and Eva referencing the identities, the login alerts from your PT account. Financial ledgers showing the dispersal to shell entities. Then it's depositions, then indictments. Miles loaded the timeline onto the screen. Dates. IP logs transaction chain, back to Lucas's Cayman account, then onward to other money features. Pattern recognition charts, visuals made for juries, yet crisp enough for traders. What about veterans already affected? Anna asked. I rubbed my forehead. We need outreach through Sentinel Foundation. Public disclosure audit. We'll notify arrested parties, but offer early restitution process for those ready to sue. Anna nodded. I'll start that. I tapped the screen again. The more we prep now, the sooner control shifts. Lucas used my trust, my tools to operate. That trust is what we'll shred. Cole stood witness list Jerome's mum, your analytics team forensic accountants, Agent Miller and Chen. We'll need court-ready docs. I nodded. Do the work. We play hardball, but we do it clean. They flinched because I rarely used words like that. But this was war, clean or not. That afternoon, I sat in my small office staring at my ID badge pinned to the wall. I'd designed the framework that was now part of this case. I needed closure, foundational change. The next day, reports appeared. Veterans groups were preparing class actions. Anonymous accounts were frozen. News outlets ran headlines. Valen Group raises $10 million of fraud, affecting 300 veterans inside the scam. It was bigger than I anticipated, but it's what justice demanded. I spent the night drafting affidavits and narrative statements. I assumed federal depositions the next morning. I had 90 pages of detailed forensic logs, charts, travel documentation, all compiled with precision. Everything moved so fast. As I finally closed my laptop that night, fatigue pushing through, I realized this wasn't just personal revenge. It was redemption. For me. For every veteran whose name had been erased like the lawsuit tried to erase me. I leaned back and whispered to the dim room. They thought they could bury truth. They buried victims instead. But I dug it all out. I refused interviews, declined camera lenses, ignored hot takes. I believed justice should speak louder than fame. Yet overnight, my mailbox filled not with press releases, but with letters. Hundreds of them. Postmarked, small towns and big cities alike, handwritten notes, typed testimonies, even children's drawings. They told stories of stolen identities and ruined futures. They shared names veterans I'd never met, spouses left to pick up the pieces. One letter came from a widow in Ohio whose husband's identity had been used in a fraudulent claim. She thanked me for giving her closure. Another from a disabled Marine in Tucson who said he could finally sleep without fear of his account being drained. But the one that stopped my breath belonged to a 10-year-old boy, his handwriting uneven but heartfelt. Dear Colonel Merritt, my dad came back from deployment, but he wouldn't touch his bank account. He thought someone stole his life. You fixed it. He said you're his hero. I unfolded the paper carefully and read it 3 times before I could speak. Hero. I had never wanted to be that for anyone. I had simply defended what was mine, what belonged to all of us. I placed the letter on my desk and stared at its jagged edges. In that moment, I realized silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy. My refusal to engage media didn't silence my voice. It let the victims find theirs. The letters came from people who had endured suspicion, shame, financial collapse. I was accused of mental instability, one pastor wrote. Another wife said, they made me feel like I lost my husband twice. Every note carried pain and hope. I answered a few, personally, thanking them, promising Sentinel Foundation would support them through recovery. For most, I forwarded to our pro bono legal team. For the kid from Ohio, I sent a small care package and a note. Your dad's fight inspired me. Thank you for telling me. The Foundation's outreach coordinator, Anna, compiled the messages into a binder labelled Letters of Integrity. She said someday we'd build a museum of truth around them. Not everyone praised me. That was the price of dragging your own blood into the light. On forums, people said I took it too far, that I should have handled it privately, or that family matters don't belong in federal court. Some reporters tried to dig into my own records, suggesting my years of silence were suspicious. A tabloid ran a headline, Camille Harwood Patriot or Predator. I didn't flinch. They didn't know what I'd seen, what I'd survived. But I would be lying if I said it didn't sting. One night, I walked past a restaurant where Lucas and I used to eat after church. A couple stared at me through the window. The woman whispered something. Her partner turned away. That's when it hit me. Vindication doesn't erase stigma. Justice doesn't always restore reputation. And still, I wouldn't undo any of it. I met other survivors face to face at a veterans legal outreach event we held in Charlotte. One man, a Navy vet named Raymond, gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. I never knew who to trust after my brother forged my disability paperwork. He said his eyes rimmed red. But you reminded me, some of us still hold the line. Later, I sat in a folding chair under harsh gymnasium lights, reading letter after letter as the crowd thinned. A woman knelt beside me, African American, mid-50s, with salt and pepper curls. "My daughter served," she said. "She died thinking her name didn't matter. But seeing what you did, I think it mattered again." I nodded, tears burning. "It always mattered," I said softly. Back home, I created a private wall on it, pinned dozens of those letters and cards, each one a reminder. I called it The Echo. Some nights when memories clawed back Lucas's cold stare, Ava's false smile, I stood in front of that wall and remembered why I chose to speak. Anna once asked if I'd ever go public, write a book, give interviews. "There's demand," she said. "People want your voice." But I shook my head. Not yet. Maybe never. Sometimes healing isn't public. Sometimes it's in the silence we choose. What I did do was write policies, new safeguards. I began working with non-profit groups to revise the very system Lucas had exploited. I gave testimony behind closed doors to Senate subcommittees, helping draft frameworks to protect power of attorney abuse. No cameras, no quotes, just quiet work. And still, the letters kept coming. Some sent small photos, smiling families' headstones, newly replaced checks finally received. One came with a single line. "Because of you, I didn't give up. I kept that one by my bed." That morning, I stood still for a long time before getting dressed. No uniform, no podium, just a woman who had been erased and decided to write herself back in. I walked into the courthouse one last time, not to fight, but to speak. The final hearing wasn't about Lucas or Eva. They were already behind bars, facing federal charges. This time, my parents sat in the front row, smaller somehow, less sure of themselves. I hadn't spoken to them in months. They hadn't spoken to me much longer than that. Still, I had asked they be allowed in. When the judge gave me the floor, I stood slowly. The courtroom was quiet. Journalists were there, but subdued, now outnumbered by families, veterans, and legal staff who'd followed the case since day one. "I'm not here to recount what happened," I began. "The court has done that. The law has done that. I'm here to choose what happens next." I turned slightly toward my parents. "You failed to defend me. You believed the lies. Maybe because they were easier. Maybe because you needed to." I paused. "But I don't need to punish you. That would be a cycle I refuse to keep alive. So I ask for leniency in your involvement. Not because I forget, but because I forgive quietly." My mother looked down. My father blinked back tears. The judge nodded. Then I turned to the full room. In the months since this case became public, I received over 1,000 letters from people who, like me, had their names taken. Some by fraud, some by family, some by silence, some by mental health misjudgments that were never theirs to carry. I inhaled deeply. That's why I founded the Sentinel Foundation. We investigate identity theft, targeting veterans and people under guardianship. We fight systems that make it easier to lose your name than to reclaim it. We're quiet, but we are not small. The screen behind me lit up with numbers. 312 veterans helped, $9.4 million in recovered funds, 5 state reforms initiated. I didn't need applause. I needed policy. My voice softened. To the people who once tried to define me by power of attorney, by psychiatric edits, by forged signatures and fake care, I don't speak your names anymore. I speak my own. I took a breath. Not Colonel, not Merritt, just Camille. The name they tried to take but couldn't. I stepped down. That was all. After the hearing, no reporters followed. Some victims came to hug me. Others just nodded quietly. I wasn't a celebrity. I was a mirror they'd waited for. A man in his 70s stopped me at the exit and said, "You made me brave enough to ask for my records back." Later that week, I uploaded the final clip to our foundation's private storytelling page. I didn't overproduce it. Just a chair, a camera, and me reading survivor letters ending with my own story. I looked into the lens. Drop your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it. And they did. By the dozens, then hundreds. Each one proof that silence doesn't mean surrender, it means saving your words until they matter most.